On again, and over to you. Thanks so much again, Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for de-escalation strategies for healthcare workers. Just a little bit before we begin. So I don't have really any conflicts of interest, but just to let you know, I am a consultant for my job. And so one of my regular clients is the Downtown Young Business Improvement Area. So I have an ongoing consultant relationship with them, as well as one-off other organizations as we go. And the other kind of disclosure here is that I do charge standard fees for workshops and talks. So I am being paid for this tonight. Other than that, no potential conflicts of interest. And let's begin. So the learning objectives tonight, after this webinar, participants should be able to deepen their understanding of what can make de-escalation difficult, name the 5 skill areas in the CELS framework, and apply de-escalation skills to sample scenarios shared in the training. So I will give you an opportunity to create and share your own scenarios in a little bit. And then if we have time, I have a couple of scenarios we can work on together at the end. So a little bit about me. My background is in social work, but I've been focused on mental health education specifically since 2010. A little bit about my perspective. It's not the only perspective, it's just my perspective, and I want to let you know where I'm coming from, so that kind of sets the stage for tonight's presentation. So I only talk about verbal communication and de-escalation skills. I don't do I'm not an expert in any kind of physical restraints, any kind of physical interaction at all. My advice for that is, if it gets physical, get out of there. So that's not within my scope, any kind of physical interaction. What I'm looking at is how can we use verbal communication and de-escalation skills in these moments. Sometimes we're able to prevent things from getting more aggressive, sometimes not. But in my experience, there are a number of things we can do when another person is upset, things that can help to soothe them, to help ourselves stay calm in the situation, and we'll go through that skills framework a little bit later. One of the other principles I come from, or things I try to follow, is call for backup when you need to. You don't need to be a hero. And in fact, if you're interacting with someone and you're doing all the right things, you're staying calm, you're using all your de-escalation skills, and it doesn't seem to be working, doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, but it can actually be a de-escalation skill in itself if you're able to recognize that, you know what, I need to tap out and let somebody else take over. So sometimes calling for backup is a colleague or another volunteer or another family member, depending on the work that you're doing. It could be a supervisor. In some cases, if necessary, it might be security or even police. But calling for backup when you need to is one of the kind of underpinnings that I try to come from in terms of de-escalation. Another underpinning for me is that mental distress doesn't make bad behavior okay. And conversely, bad behavior is often not mental health related. So some of the worst behavior I've seen from other human beings in my time on this planet has had nothing to do with mental health stuff. And if a person is experiencing distress of various kinds, that doesn't give them a right to be abusive towards you. So I just want to make that distinction clear, that if somebody is behaving badly, perhaps not you folks because of your experience in the field, but sometimes I've worked with groups who may automatically assume when a person is getting loud or getting verbally aggressive, then it must be a mental health problem. And in my experience, that may be one of the things people are dealing with in their moment of upset. But even if we know for sure that a person has a particular mental health diagnosis, it doesn't really necessarily tell us anything about what's going on for them in that moment. They may be upset for all kinds of reasons that may or may not have anything to do with a label that they've received for their mental health. So bad behavior is not always mental health related. And just because a person is experiencing distress doesn't make it okay to be abusive or aggressive. I believe also in the right to feelings versus the expression of feelings. So what I mean by this is I believe a person has a right to be angry, They have a right to be angry at me. I might not love it, but they do have a right to be angry at me. But that doesn't mean they have a right to throw a chair at me, for example. So I believe that people have a right to their feelings, but that doesn't mean that any behavior associated with the feeling is okay. And feelings themselves can't hurt you. They can't hurt the person. They can't hurt us. Feelings themselves. Sometimes people will attach behavior to the feelings, and then that can be painful, emotionally and otherwise, potentially. But people have a right to their feelings. And in my experience, telling a person not to have a feeling doesn't necessarily make the feeling go away and may direct a new feeling at you. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And finally, the other place I try to come from is respect as the underpinning of all interactions. I know this can be easier said than done when people are not treating you with respect. And we'll talk about some of the challenges around that. But I think whenever you can tap into a sense of common humanity, tapping into, perhaps you're even saying to the person, I'm walking away, or you're walking away yourself. You can do that still in a respectful way. Respect doesn't mean that the person can hurt you, but respect does mean that you still, respect I could use another word. You still sort of acknowledge and attend to the fact that they're a human being. And sometimes people may be expecting you to treat them with the disrespect that they've shown, or treat them with the disrespect that they've received before. So it can actually shift things a little bit in one of these complicated, uncomfortable conversations if they're expecting you to be disrespectful or be judgmental or be angry and loud with them, and you choose a different way. Now, we'll go to the chat. And is there anything I should know so far?
You're all good to keep going.
Okay, thanks everyone. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to invite you to do is just write this down on your own. Don't put it in the chat yet unless you really, really, really love the chat. I'll give you an opportunity to put it in the chat later, but what I'm going to ask you to do now is to jot down for yourself an example of a challenging scenario. We won't be able to get to all of them, but I want you to have this one in mind as we're moving through, and you can reflect on whether the skills we're talking about would have been useful there. Perhaps you've used some of the skills and you just called it something else. So again, we'll look at a few scenarios later, but for now, I'd like to give you a moment to create a scenario. So this can be based on something you've experienced, witnessed, or it can be invented. It only needs to be a couple of sentences, and we'll hopefully get to discuss some of these later in the workshop. So for the purposes of this, I don't want you to, for the purposes of keeping yourself safe and comfortable this evening, I don't want you to pick the most difficult situation you've ever had, or anything that was in particular very traumatic or painful. Don't pick the hardest thing that ever happened, but something that is challenging that you may face again, something where verbal de-escalation skills might have come in handy. So I'm going to give you just 2 minutes to jot this down, and then we'll continue on. Just 1 more minute to work on your scenario, and then I'll move us along. Okay, perfect. If you need a little time, of course, I can't see you, so feel free to keep working, get a snack, whatever you'd like to do. Okay, thanks for that. And hang on to those, and we will be talking about those a little bit later in the session. Okay, so to talk about communication skills and de-escalation skills, I use the CELS framework. Now, you won't have heard of this framework if you haven't taken a session with me before, because I made up the acronym, but I did not make up the skills. I want to highlight that. These are skills that you're already using. And I just like a handy little acronym because it helps us remember. So We're going to go through each of these skills today and talk about what are some of the challenges around that, what are some ways we can kind of concretize these skills, and then I'll ask you some examples and reflections as we go. So we're going to go through each of these, but CEL stands for calm, empathy, listening, limits, and self-awareness. And I'm probably going to say 1,000 times this evening that many of these are easier said than done. I can appreciate that there are lots of reasons why we're not necessarily able to tap into these skills in a given escalated moment, but we're going to try. We're going to talk a little bit about what makes them more difficult sometimes. So the first one we're going to talk about is calm. So again, easier said than done. I would love it if you could pop in the chat some examples of what can make staying calm challenging. And then I'll ask Val to read me a few, or as many as you like.
So we have a few coming in: being disrespected, someone throwing things, high emotions, someone yelling at you, people making you feel as if you don't know what you're doing, insults, a high pressure situation like a patient having a lot of pain. If the other person is agitated, it can be hard to keep your own calm. Depending on the topic of the conversation, when somebody puts words in my mouth, broken commitments, if you are busy, hungry, tired, feeling physically threatened or actually being physically attacked. If you've had experiences, so triggers around past challenges. When people make it personal, they're targeting who they are as a person.
Beautiful. Those are great. That's
a good, a fear.
Yeah.
Is another emotion somebody shared.
That's big. Those are wonderful. Thank you so much. And this is a lovely big group. Thank you so much for all of your feedback. I really, really appreciate that. So some of the things you're saying, some of them are happening within you. Some of them are coming from the other person. Some of them might be external things, logistics, or what's happening around you, or external pressure. Sometimes we're dealing with all of those things at once. The other person's stuff, our stuff, and what's happening around us. And all of those things that you mentioned absolutely make staying calm extremely challenging. And a lot of those aren't necessarily avoidable, right? Sometimes there's some things we can do to navigate some of them. But I think one of the skills that we have at our disposal is recognizing I'm not going to be able to rein it in right now. For really good reasons, I'm not going to be able to get back to a place of calm. And I think that when we're able to do that, that actually can help us. That self-awareness, which I'm going to speak of in a few minutes, goes hand in hand with the calm. Because sometimes people, as Val mentioned, somebody mentioned in the chat, people are very adept at hurting your feelings and more. But this is within the scope of verbal de-escalation today. People can be very skilled at finding the thing that's really going to be painful and insulting and upsetting in this moment. And so that can be incredibly difficult to stay calm in those moments. In my experience, modeling calm is much more effective than preaching calm. Now, think about times that people have said to you the following types of statements: calm down, relax, don't get upset, don't be angry. I've certainly said those things inadvertently before and not received the best response. So sometimes we may be better at, certainly I am better at staying calm professionally, but then sometimes in my personal life goes out the window. I'm a real delight to live with, I'll tell you that much. So when you're able to, sometimes I've heard people say, like, for example, in the security guard business, I've worked with a number of security guard groups over the years. And they said to me early on with working with them, they said, that's a no-no in our business. We don't tell people to calm down. I mean, of course they do sometimes, but the idea is you're not supposed to, because it really does potentially add fuel to the fire, and it's not effective in terms of calming down the person. So this is another opportunity to kind of attend to your part of the web. What can I do to stay calm myself rather than trying to make the other person calm down? Because in fact, when I'm staying calm myself, that's when I'm going to have my best chances of giving them the opportunity to calm down. They won't necessarily take it, but in my experience, modeling calm, much more effective than preaching calm. So in these moments, some of the examples that you shared where people are making it very difficult to stay calm, what helps you or what has helped you in the past to stay calm? I'd love to hear some ideas about what's worked for you.
While those are rolling in, somebody asked, should I just pretend to I am calm, even though I'm really upset internally?
Good. Actually, before you go on, Val, I'll respond to that. That's a great question. So I think that we can be two things at the same time, or many more things. But in my experience, I'm not always, but in an escalated situation, I'm usually able to stay calm, even though I feel tense in my body, nervous inside, anxious, all these things. I think that it doesn't mean you're being phony, but I think it's possible to hold more than one thing at the same time and try to project a level of calm, even if you don't feel fully calm inside. I think that and sometimes if you're not able to do it, that's okay. That's a skill in itself, recognizing I can't calm down. Sometimes when I get the shaky voice or there's other signs that you know about yourself, it's past the point of calm now. How do I rein it in? So that's a great question. Thank you.
So lots of responses coming in, lots of people breathing, taking a walk, counting to 10, relying on bringing in the teams, putting things in perspective, some self-talk about trying not to take things personally, pausing before responding, talking more softly, so being in tune to your voice, listening to music, silence, letting it roll off like the duck on the surface. Somebody's mentioned the stop technique. I'm not 100% sure what that is.
It's a mindfulness technique, but I forget what the acronym stands for. I'm not sure.
Maybe Beth, you can let us know. Kind of switch the focus to more of a task and what you're doing kind of physically. Having a sip of water or tea. Somebody talked about, again, that perspective. What is the worst thing that can happen here?
Beautiful work. So something tells me that many of you could perhaps give this workshop rather than attend it. So I am hearing that there's a lot of skill already, and you've unfortunately probably had a lot of practice implementing these tools to try to stay calm in moments when you were seeing people who are definitely not at their best and who may sometimes be taking that out on you. So here are a couple.
I have the STOP acronym.
Oh, yes.
Stop, take a deep breath, observe internally and externally, and proceed mindfully.
Yes. Okay.
Dialectical behavior therapy.
Okay, I have come across that, but I forgot what it meant. So that's lovely. Thank you for that. So some other ideas on the screen here, but most of them were ones that you've already mentioned. Yeah. And might be, I heard some good examples of like taking a walk or doing something physically. And in fact, although that's not the topic of today's session, there's a beautiful book called Burnout by Amelia and Emily Nagoski. And they talk about completing the stress cycle and how to move the stress through your body. Because sometimes, even if you've done something about the stressor, and sometimes you can't do anything about the stressor, but even if the stressor has moved on, you still have that stress in your body. And so they have some excellent ideas about moving the stress along and how do you do that. And physical movement, breathing, positive affection, connection with others, positive social interaction, crying, laughter. All of these things are what you can do to move it out of your body. Of course, you're not necessarily going to be able to do all those things in the moment of staying calm. I was talking to a group the other day, and I was we were talking about telling yourself to breathe deeply or to slow down your breath. And of course, you are saying those things internally, not externally, because the other person will then think you're talking to them and they will get quite irritated beyond what's already happening. So again, doing what you can to model calm while recognizing there are moments where that's not going to be possible, and that's okay. Recognizing if there's an option to step away, do that. If there's an option for somebody else to step forward, great. If there isn't an option, what can you do to get through it to the best of your ability? Now, connected to empathy, or connected to calm sometimes, is empathy, because sometimes when we're able to tap into empathy for the other person and they're upset, it also helps us to stay calm. So all of these skills work together. They're not necessarily discrete, and it's certainly not a step-by-step situation. Quick check, Val, am I missing anything?
I think we're doing okay. There's been some, Ruth shared the full title and the author again of the book. So there's some
great.
there.
I love that. Thank you. Sometimes I'm so glad that you're doing this, because I would just look at the chat and forget what I was doing. So the second skill we're talking about today is empathy. I highly recommend this beautiful book. It's one of my favorite books on this topic, certainly. It's called There Is No Good Card for This: What to Say and Do When Life is Scary, Awful, and Unfair to People You Love. And so even though, you know, I have experience doing care work for a living, as you all do, or most of you do, I still found this to be very helpful. And there are a really good sort of tool, a really good manual for how to show up sustainably. Because, you know, sometimes we want to show up, or sometimes we're tasked with showing up. And when we're able to show up with some degree of love, as opposed to only out of obligation, it changes the quality of the interaction, in my experience. So you don't always have a choice. Sometimes, I understand, especially when it's part of your job, sometimes you have to show up whether you feel like it or not with the other person in their pain. But what's really beautiful about this book is it gives some really tangible, concrete tips around how to show up, how to make it sustainable, and how to tap into what your gifts are. For example, in my experience, there are some people who are fantastic about bringing food over to somebody when they're in trouble. That is my least skilled area. You do not want my casserole. However, I am not afraid to sit and hold your hand, which sometimes the casserole bringers want you to do that. So working together and tapping into other people's strengths can be really helpful when you're showing up for people who struggle. And although this is for outside of work, this particular book, I have found a lot of things within it useful for work as well. So empathy is about feeling with, it's about using your imagination to tap into or to tune into what you might feel like in the person's situation. Now, remember that often anger is a protective skin over more vulnerable feelings. So often, what's underneath anger? In terms of a more primary feeling or emotion.
Couple of 3 folks that said fear.
Yeah, exactly. Fear or sadness or both. So it's not to discount the anger. And I also want to recognize that at this stage of life, I'm feeling I'm sort of tapping into anger that I didn't always access before. So sometimes it's really legitimate to be angry, and I don't want to pathologize anger. But when we're angry, and especially when we're taking out our anger on someone else, which I don't recommend, when we're doing that, it's more than one thing going on. There is the anger, but underneath, there's also something more primary that the person might be trying to protect, often unconsciously. But fear in particular fuels anger, but sometimes there might be sadness there as well. Now, recognizing that there is something softer underneath is not the same as naming there is something softer underneath. I would not advise you to say, oh, you're really shouting, but I know you're underneath, you're really scared. No, because we don't want to do in de-escalation, we don't want to do anything that makes the person feel more small, more vulnerable, more ashamed. They may already feel that way, and we don't want to do, even if they're behaving in a way that suggests they do not feel ashamed or vulnerable. It's really hard to imagine that they might. When we can remember that that softness, that vulnerability is underneath, it can help us sometimes, no matter what they're doing, to tap into that empathy for the other person. Now, you're not always going to be able to access the empathy in the moment. And there are moments where it's not going to be your go-to. When your goal is de-escalation, I'm going to say that a few times because sometimes your goal might be different, but we're assuming for the purposes of this conversation today that in a given moment when the other person is really angry and upset, your goal, you might have other goals, but one of your primary goals is to contribute to de-escalation. You can't actually de-escalate another person. What you can do is keep yourself de-escalated, and in so doing, give the other person the opportunity to de-escalate themselves and have the opportunity to connect with you. They will not always take that opportunity. There might be other things coming into play that make that difficult for them. But you can't control, and as much as we would like to, we can't actually control other people or their behavior, which is a lesson that I teach people and continue to struggle to learn myself every day. Cannot change other people or their behavior. People can change, but you can't change them. So in terms of showing up, we are not always, in my experience, I can't always access empathy in the moment for the person who's upset. If they're being really verbally aggressive with me, if they're being really rude or insulting, it's naturally quite hard. It's an evolutionary trauma response to protect ourselves rather than digging in to find the empathy. However, even if we can't do it in the moment, in my experience, after the fact, if we're able to reflecting or debriefing with colleagues or journaling about it or thinking about it as we walk, whatever we need to do after to take care of ourselves, when we're looking back on that moment, if we're able to see the person a little bit more fully, imagine that there might be other more vulnerable experiences there, like fear and sadness, not just the anger, not just the behavior that we saw, but that really there's behavior is information, and there's probably other stuff going on that person is carrying. Now, when we're able to do that after the fact, in my experience, it helps me to put it down more quickly and more fully. It doesn't hitch a ride with me, these upsetting conversations, in the same way when I'm able to tap into some empathy for the person. That is not to say if the situation does hitch a ride with you and you're not able to shake it and you feel really distressed, I'm not saying that's your fault. I'm not saying if you only found some empathy, it wouldn't stick around. No, not at all. Not at all. And sometimes there will be moments with really good reason you are not going to be able to find that empathy before, during, or after the event. And that's okay too. But when we can try to reach for empathy at some point in the interaction, either during or after, it helps the other person to feel more supported and heard, which cuts down on their need to be aggressive. And it also helps us to move through it a little bit more with a little bit more grace and competence and a little bit more calm when we can tap into that empathy. So Crow and McDowell explained empathy this way. We consider compassion to be the heart's natural instinctive response to the pain of others. Empathy is when you use your imagination to expand your ability to feel compassion for people in situations beyond those you have experienced, maybe even in situations completely different from those you have known. And so sometimes we think we're only able to empathize with people that we know or people when we share an experience with them. But actually, sometimes when we share an experience or we think we've had the same experience, then we end up projecting rather than empathizing and making it about us and what we might do in that situation. So the person having a different experience from us or a different background or a different history doesn't necessarily need to be a block to empathy. But there are blocks to empathy, and there are a lot of them. You want to give me a couple of examples about what makes empathy difficult?
We have a couple that have popped up here. So if you see the same person behaving in the same negative way with everybody that they interact with, it can be hard to have empathy.
Yep. At least they're consistent. Reframe. No, that's not. Yeah, of course. That's a great example. Thank you for that.
Somebody's talking about when we're feeling burned out ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of towing that line between sympathy and empathy can be a challenge.
Yep. Good. Absolutely.
Somebody mentioned about kind of almost like perseverating on a situation after, and I appreciated that you talked about kind of thinking about it after the fact. Mm-hmm. But can you take that too far.
Yeah, we absolutely can. We absolutely can. When I was younger, many years ago, and I first started out in social work, I would sort of jot down notes about things that I wanted to improve on. And then that's good. That's useful. Reflective practice matters. But I got kind of lost in that and was only focused on what I was doing wrong and wasn't able to see the other side of it, that I was also doing some things that were valuable. So yeah, definitely balancing debrief with rumination. And it depends what's going on, or processing in rumination, because they're not everybody benefits or feels comfortable debriefing verbally with someone else. I do recommend it if that's possible, but there are other ways to move the stress through, as we talked about. But yeah, it's when we get stuck in it, and a lot of times that's not our fault. It might be because something is particularly distressing about the event, or it's related to something else we've experienced, or we're not receiving appropriate support, or we're burned out, or all kinds of things. So yeah. Anything else in terms of what makes empathy difficult that you want to share?
Yeah, quite a few things came in there. So when you feel like the way a person's reacting to the situation doesn't necessarily align with the magnitude of the situation.
Yeah.
If what people are saying is hurtful to you, people who feel particularly self-entitled and feel like they have the right to not be kind to people, just the vulnerability that the conflict can create can make empathy difficult. If somebody has different values than your own, that feeling like you just can't do anything that's going to be good enough for the person.
Yeah. Great.
If somebody had an interesting comment that, sometimes it can be hard and other times it's easier. And I think given the variety of things people have commented on, I guess that makes sense, but we need to be compassionate with ourselves around how we're able to respond empathetically.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I recommend that book, because it does kind of support those moments where, okay, what makes it, because it's interesting to reflect on what makes it easier sometimes as well. I won't spend too much time on that now, but I invite you to all reflect on that maybe on your own later. Like, what are those moments when empathy is easier, and what helps you to facilitate that empathy in that moment? So for me, one of the things is when I'm feeling rested and supported and not too depleted. I'm much better. And when I'm also in the mindset of not trying to change the other person or meddle with their outcome. I can't always do those things, and those things aren't always possible. But in those moments, I find empathy easier. So sometimes it can be helpful to look at what are the things that are stopping us from tapping into empathy. And sometimes we can get creative in terms of connecting with other colleagues, or, again, it doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. That's really not my emphasis here. It's more, there are certain circumstances where empathy is easier than others. And I think you're absolutely right, Val, being gentle with yourself in those moments where it's not there, or where it's not there straight away. Sometimes it finds us later, and sometimes it can take ages, even if we're not actually actively reflecting on the thing. Sometimes if you interact with somebody else, even years later, where you might go, oh, like in a good way. I don't mean you were necessarily holding it at the forefront all that time. Oh yeah. Oh, I kind of get this in a new way. You're in the, like, when the last time I dealt with somebody with this challenge, you're not narrating this, I'm just saying it for you, that you might think, oh, actually, I understand this in a new way. So sometimes it's sort of it's definitely a process, and it's dynamic, and it ebbs and flows. And we are more likely to empathize when we're getting the support that we need. So empathy and validation are connected. So validation is not the same as agreement. Validation is essentially letting the person know that they've been seen and heard, and recognizing that a person has a right to their feelings. And on both sides of the equation, both the upset person in some moments and the calm person in other moments, I've been surprised again and again in terms of just how far validation can go to shifting the tone of the conversation. Because when you're interacting with someone, you might have interacted with someone who has already dealt with 15 other providers, either in person or on the phone, by the time they get to you. So they're carrying a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with you, let alone in terms of relationships with healthcare providers, not even related to all the other stuff they might be carrying. And they might be expecting you to say, you know, to quickly say, this isn't a big deal, or, I'm going to tell you what we're going to do, or skipping over their upset to get to the problem solving. And many of us are trained to do that, inadvertently or deliberately trained to focus on the problem solving. And it's hard because you are providing a service, you are trying to help, and absolutely that can come in some cases. But the validation, if you skip the validation and just go straight to telling the person what to do without letting them feel seen and heard, you're not going to get the cooperation that you might get if you started from a place of validation, because the person doesn't feel connected to you. So I do think it's so important to be genuine around this. If you can't find a genuine way to validate, just be quiet, just let them talk, or just redirect to what you can do. Don't be phony. I believe that when we're upset, we're even more tuned in to people that are being not fully, authentic with us. It's a bit of a superpower, because we're so sensitive when we're already so distressed that sometimes we are ready and waiting for people to, just brush us off and move us along to the next person. So validation, I have found, when somebody actually listens, which is the next skill we're going to talk about, and basically says something along the lines of these types of sentences. Now, I did this workshop in person the other day, and somebody said, "Oh, I hate those sentences because those sound really fake. That's not how I would say it." I said, "Great. That's important. Know what actually is genuine for you." And I don't advise whipping out the index card and reading these. Of course not. You've been in this business, you've been in this kind of work for a while, I'm sure. And empathy is probably something that you use every day. And these are some of the statements that can carry empathy if they're done genuinely. This is not an exhaustive list. I chose ones that I have found to be supportive when people said it to me in a genuine way. And I have found this when I was able to support other people in a genuine, empathetic way. These are the kinds of statements that you might use. However, you also don't have to say anything. We get really, especially chatty people like me, obviously, we get really sort of come in our heads around what to say. And a person can feel when you're just with them. And those of you who have perhaps worked in end of life care or working in other situations where people are in a lot of distress in various ways, the presence is more important than the talking. And so you can convey validation and empathy and the fact that you see them and you can see that they're suffering and that you're sitting beside them in this moment. You can convey that without words at all. Okay, the next skill I want to speak to is listening. I love this quote from Rachel Naomi Remen: "Our listening creates a sanctuary for the homeless parts within another person." Now, sometimes listening is very difficult for a number of reasons. Time pressures, how the person is being with you, like a lot of the examples you already gave in terms of if they're being insulting, if they're saying the same thing over and over again, if you're exhausted, if you're depleted, if you don't have appropriate supports, if you're overworked. If sometimes there might be other cognitive or language barriers that make it difficult to listen, but I think that we can pick up the tone of what the person is saying, even if we are not speaking the same language. We can get things from their tone, from the quality of their presence, from their body language, from their facial expressions, and so on. So very often, when people say, "I want you to help me with this," or maybe they'll say it in a lot of other ways that are perhaps more demanding, that might be part of it, but also they really want you to listen. When I first started doing workshops, people would come up after sometimes and ask me for resources. And at first I didn't know that resources were only a part of it. And when I would skip too quickly to giving the resources or making suggestions, I would miss something. And in fact, once I learned that and gave people the opportunity to just get out what was difficult and just let them talk and listened and tried to be empathetic, once I was able to get past my desire to fix it and jump in and offer solutions, I found that people seemed to walk away feeling a little bit hurt, I don't want to say better, but they felt heard and they felt validated, and there was a place to share their experience. And so when we can give people the opportunity to listen, it is a gift from us, and it can be a gift between us both. It can be a gift after the fact. Now, it's not always a gift to be listening if people are being really, all the things you've mentioned, insulting and loud and all the things. It can be quite hard to listen. And I do want to add a caveat to this in a moment, something that I have recently discovered that helped me. Because realistically, we cannot go walking around all day long, fully, mindfully, actively, deeply listening to every person and every interaction we have, because we would be very exhausted. However, there are moments where we can identify, a person needs to talk right now, but they don't really need me to listen. I've noticed that more recently, that sometimes people just need a sounding board and they don't actually need your feedback, and they don't need you're listening on some level, but you're not fully, deeply, mindfully listening. And sometimes that's what they need. They need a place to vent, they need a place to get it out, and they need a sounding board rather than a listener. So being able to, sometimes one of the ways you can find this is if you have provided a little feedback, and you can see it kind of throws them off, or they just want to get back on track to what they're talking about, or they kind of dismiss what you're saying. Okay, so maybe a person just needs to get out what's difficult right now. So if you are able to listen to a person, and you want to do this in as attentive a way as possible, try to focus, try to be patient as much as you can. Pay attention to what the person is saying and not saying. Try not to juggle multiple responsibilities at the same time. I would frankly rather a person be transparent and say, I can't listen right now because I have to finish this, but when I finish this, I can come and talk to you for 10 minutes. Having kind of clear limits about what you can and can't do can be important when we're talking about listening. And try not to jump to solutions. Try to listen first. Any suggestions that people have around listening, things that have helped you to be a better listener? Or we won't do barriers to listening because we did barriers for the other one. So what's any tips that you have for listening for your colleagues?
People have mentioned sitting down, stopping what you're doing and sitting.
Good.
Trying to have a good connection with people.
Mm-hmm.
Eye contact.
Mm-hmm.
Using open questions, letting them finish.
Yeah.
Being present. Don't look at your watch or your laptop. Just be with them. Using open-ended questions. Somebody mentioned paraphrasing to check that they've understood, framing and reframing what they're saying, nodding of your head to show that you understand, being silent and accepting the person that they're with if they are silent, attending to facial expression and body language, preferably being in a private area versus where there's other people around.
Yeah.
Sitting beside somebody, not across from them.
Yeah, lovely.
Good body language.
Beautiful. So I just want to highlight a couple of things there. All great ideas. So there were people that had some active listening tips in terms of open-ended listening, reflecting back, eye contact. With eye contact, I have found it's helpful to sort of reflect back what the other person is doing. You don't want to be too intense with the eye contact for lots of reasons. People don't feel comfortable with that. So kind of trying to reflect back what they're doing around eye contact. And I love the suggestion of sitting beside the person rather than straight across from them. Actually, you may have heard, those of you who are parents of teenagers, they used to recommend that as a way to talk to your teenager is to take them for a drive, because it was less confronting than being face to face, and you could sit side by side. And so I love those. Some great creative ideas in terms of how to show up and how to listen. Anything else?
I think we kind of got them all.
Thanks, everyone. Such great feedback. Okay, so the next skill is limits. And oftentimes listening and limits go hand in hand. For example, you may start out listening and then you need to set some limits as time wears on. And perhaps when we let a person vent, the distinction I make for myself is when they're venting, it's like letting the air out of the balloon. And so you can see or hear the person calming down somewhat as they get off their chest what's difficult or what's distressing for them. When it's ranting, it gets bigger over time. Now, you may have a little ebb and flow with venting, but with ranting, it gets bigger and louder. And if it's going on and on and on, and this is making it difficult for you to do your work or to show up with them, sometimes you have to set some limits. And sometimes, we're called to do this in lots of ways all the time. I could spend a whole day session or 3-day session on boundaries. So I'm only just going to touch on it now. We can't give it the space it deserves today, but I just want to give you a couple of things to think about. So one way of looking at this distinction is boundaries are saying this is okay for me and this is not okay for me. And limits is making requests of the other person's behavior. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to change their behavior, but if you're making the request, then you can decide what to do after. But boundary setting and limit setting doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in context. So it's influenced by where you work, how you grew up, how you're treated, how society treats you, your relationships with your relationship with the person who you're setting a boundary with, your family upbringing, power dynamics of various kinds, and so on. So setting those limits is easier said than done. And I'm going to, let me just skip ahead. I want to make sure I offered these references. Yeah, I think I did. I'm going to come back to those other slides in a moment, but I do want to recommend these 3 books in particular, especially the first 2, in terms of setting boundaries. So the first is Empowered Boundaries, Speaking Truth, Setting Boundaries, and Inspiring Social Change by Christian Storm. What I love about this book is Christian Storm points out how sometimes when we've experienced a boundary violation, we look back on the incident and we focus on, oh, I should have done this, I should have done that. And in fact, she suggests that a lot of times we set great boundaries, but it doesn't mean the other person is going to respect them. The other person needs to be responsible for the boundary violation. It's not all on us. And sometimes it's not on us at all. So she instead invites us to look back on a situation where there's been a boundary violation and to say, instead of what did I do wrong, or I should have done this, I should have done that, she invites us to ask ourselves, what did I do to survive? And I love that because very often we tap into these skills instinctively when we're in a moment. It's a evolutionary trauma response that kicks in to protect us in various ways in a given setting where we need to set boundaries. So I invite you to read that one. The second one I love even as much, even better. I don't know, they're tied. The second book on the screen is Set Boundaries, Find Peace, A Guide to Reclaiming Yourself by Nedra Glover-Tawwab, counselor out of the States. She's done some beautiful work on practical strategies for setting boundaries in a variety of settings, including with in-laws, in your workplace, with your boss, with your neighbors. So it's really helpful in that way. And the last one is sort of infuses some of my work today in terms of de-escalation. It's diffusing angry people. Practical tools for handling bullying, threats, and violence. So it does go into a bit more detail. If you're worried about or dealing with physical violence, you may find that book to be helpful. So I'm going to go back to what we were talking about here. So how do we set limits? So there are lots of ways that we set limits, and I want to highlight that sometimes it's a nonverbal way. So I was working with a group once, a wellness group of clients years ago, and one person in the group reached out and tapped somebody else on the shoulder, and that was not okay with her. And she made that very clear by taking an enormous step back. And I thought that was so creative and so clear. She made it very clear, that's not okay for me. This is my boundary. Please don't touch me again, without saying a word, right? So sometimes we're setting limits when we're taking a step back, when we're walking away from a person, when we're changing our tone of voice. Somebody mentioned getting quieter, right? Not exactly boundary setting, but it can be a tool connected to it. So sometimes we're saying things, though. Sometimes we might have to say things. What you want to do is to address aggressive behavior without making the person feel humiliated or vulnerable, because that taps into their need to lash back louder, for example. And it's hard not to do that because, again, if the person is trying to make you feel humiliated and vulnerable, it's hard not to attack back in that way. But if your goal is de-escalation, I advise you to stay calm yourself and to address the behavior without shaming the person. So you could say something like, it makes sense that you're angry, but I need you to stop yelling at me. I realize this is important to you and I'm trying to help, but I need you to stop shouting so I can do it. And sometimes I like that we language. We're getting nowhere arguing about this, so why don't we just stop and start again? Sometimes, depending on the conversation, I've said, okay, let's agree to disagree. That's your opinion. Let's get back to how I can help you today. So sometimes, depending on what your role is, there might be an opportunity to redirect, but it is really okay to set limits. And sometimes this is difficult depending on your workplace, right? So tips for setting boundaries at work. Pay attention to your own red flags. Oh, that's number 2. Let me do number 1 first. So identify your own limits. So pay attention to yourself and notice what you can tolerate and accept, as well as what makes you feel uncomfortable and stressed, because this self-awareness is really helpful in terms of identifying what are your boundaries, what are the limits, and when people push past that, what are the feelings that you experience. So for me, and I am talking more here about everyday kind of boundary violations, not violence or something bigger and more extreme, more serious, but everyday violations like, I've said yes to something I don't want to do, or, somebody has pushed past what I said was okay in terms of a given setting. So for me, resentment is the key piece of information that tells me, seems like there's been a little bit of a boundary violation here. Sometimes it's on my end, sometimes it's on their end, sometimes it's both. So pay attention to your feelings, what your own red flags are. For some people, it might be discomfort, resentment, or guilt. Paying attention to when, and we feel uncomfortable all the time for lots of reasons. That's not necessarily bad. Sometimes we're uncomfortable when we're learning, when there's opportunities to grow. But here we're talking about boundaries. There's a particular quality of discomfort sometimes that we feel when a boundary has been pushed. And so it's part of it is recognizing what that is, how that feels in yourself. Give yourself permission to set boundaries. This is hard because a lot of times we're socialized and taught again and again in lots of settings, say yes all the time, do all the things. It sometimes is, goes against maybe the official instruction. For example, I work with a lot of customer service groups where, the sort of tagline is the customer is always right, except the customer is not always right, as we know, and the patient and the family is not always right either, right? But it is okay to set boundaries, and sometimes that gives the person the opportunity to shift how they're behaving as well. And consider your environment. This is vague, but it means it means thinking about what's at stake if you set a boundary and if you don't set it. And are there supports you need to set that boundary? For example, if your boss has asked you for something to do something that you don't feel comfortable doing, can you talk to a colleague? Is there somebody from HR? Is there somebody else that can support you with that? So consider your environment, because these boundary setting is a very nimble, sort of always changing dynamic process. And so what works in one setting or in one relationship won't necessarily work in the next one. That's just general talk about boundaries. Time check. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So there was a question, and you kind of started responding, but I think somebody would like you to go a little bit more deeper into.
Sure.
How do you deal with the situations where you set a boundary and the person doesn't even acknowledge that you set a boundary and they just keep going?
Yep.
So, that's not okay. I need you to stop yelling, and they keep yelling. And then you say, I need you to stop yelling, and they keep yelling. So,
okay, good. So it depends, unfortunately or fortunately, whenever it's a human being involved, the answer is usually it depends. So there's no template that you can just drape over this, but you do have some choices. Now it depends on the relationship, but if you set the boundary and they're ignoring it, first of all, recognizing that they're ignoring it and that you set the boundary is a skill in itself. Okay, I did what I came here to do. That's my part of it. Now you decide what to do next. Depending on the relationship and your role and what's going on, in some moments you might choose to set the boundary again and give them another chance to respect it. If they don't, and some people will negotiate that in different ways, right? But you have the right to end the conversation, to walk away, to come back to it later. It's, if somebody is repeatedly ignoring your boundaries, that says more about you than it says about them, but that's going to have a negative impact on you, right? And there's only so much you can do. So I think take a step back and get support, whatever that, and that means different things, but it depends on what the relationship, right, is. Like if it's your boss, it might be different than if it's a patient, but I do think you have a right to walk away, whatever that means for you, if the person is not respecting your boundary. The thing about setting boundaries is when we set boundaries, we risk disappointing people. And sometimes we've spent much of our lives trying to find ways to not disappoint people. And sometimes it's a bigger feeling than that for sure. But like, it's okay to disappoint people. If you set a boundary and they're ignoring it, you can make some decisions about how you're going to respond next. Maybe you need to pause, maybe say, we'll come back to this. Maybe you need to take a breath, whatever you need to do to think about what's best for you moving forward. That's a bit vague, but it really does depend on the relationship.
When you walk away from
Yeah.
a situation, would you say something like, okay, I've asked you to stop yelling. That boundary doesn't seem to be working, so we're gonna take a break from this. Like, help me with some words, Rebecca.
Sometimes you can, right? And sometimes if you're in a situation like where let's say it's a patient who's really angry and they're swearing at you and you said, I've asked you not to swear at me. Yeah, you can say I'm walking away now, or I'm going to go see another patient, or I'm going to take a break because I asked you to stop yelling and you're still yelling, right? I think it's not so much the words as the tone of voice, and sometimes they're going to remember more the walking away than what you said. But so, yeah, it's really fine to narrate. I tend to narrate everything for better, for worse. So it's really fine to narrate that. I've asked you to do this. You haven't done this, so I'm walking away now. They may get more pissed off, but they may get more pissed off anyway, no matter what you do. You're not actually responsible for another person's emotions. You do your best to take care of your part of the web, as I said, and to take care of yourself and to show up in ways that feel manageable and safe. And if you're not able to continue, it's not a character flaw. So yeah, does that help at all? Did I give you a few words? Val, you're a tricky one. All right, self-awareness. So let's move on to the next skill areas. So I'm gonna invite you to, Val, do we ever do group breakout rooms, or it doesn't work because it's webinar?
Yeah, we don't have that with webinar.
Okay, no, I should have asked you before. No problem. We're gonna do this anyway. I'm going to actually give you a couple minutes to reflect on this, because self-awareness is so important when we're talking about de-escalation. So I'll invite you to respond. I'm going to give you 3 minutes. Respond in writing on your own. Hopefully you have something to write with, or if you'd rather just think about it, that's okay too. But I'll invite you to respond to these questions. If it feels like too much today and just want to do one, that's fine. I'm going to give you 3 minutes to work on it. The first question is, what kinds of things really get to you in a difficult conversation? How does it feel in your body when that happens? And how do you handle these situations? And so this is a self-awareness piece. So I won't ask you to share these, because there are similarities, but it also depends on the person. But this is to help you tap into, how do I actually feel? What's going on in my feelings and in my body when I'm in a situation where things are highly escalated and where it's hard for me to calm down? What does that actually feel like? And what do I do to navigate that? Because I want to give you a chance to tap into your own skills there as well. So 3 minutes for this. We'll come back at 7:33. Just a minute left for this reflection, and then we'll continue on. Thanks, everyone. Okay, welcome back, everybody. So hopefully that gave you a chance to start or continue a reflection a bit around this. And I mean, sometimes I've noticed that I get kind of a feeling in my chest, and it took me a long time to notice that, actually. So I think when we pay attention to what those body cues are, as well as what's happening in our thoughts and feelings, it can actually help us to be better de-escalators. A little bit more about self-awareness. So try to pay attention to your own reactions generally, in terms of what are the kinds of things that really get to you, and what conditions do you need in order to be at your best in terms of de-escalation, and when are those conditions not happening, and what, sometimes there's something you can do about that, and sometimes not. But for example, if you have already had 15 really difficult conversations today where people were highly upset, and you have a colleague who's just come on shift and it's fresh and calm, maybe, working together to maybe let that person take over the next one. And sometimes it can be a helpful tool to just pay attention to when you're tapped out, and to be able to say to a colleague, you know what, I can't do any more of these today. I've done a lot, because it takes a toll on you. Even if you're a skilled de-escalator and you've had this conversation or some version of it many times, these kinds of conversations are uncomfortable and painful, and sometimes they really stick with you. And it's not an unlimited supply of energy for these kinds of conversations. So working with others and working as a team is important. You can't control someone else's behavior, but you can control your own, although there are moments where it will feel like you can't control your own either, but you can keep an eye on it and try to rein it in, and at least pay attention to what's happening within yourself. Try not to let your ego and pride take over. This is hard if people are trying to puncture your side, metaphorically, with various insults and things that they think might get you. Something that I've noticed out in the world, and noticing escalation and de-escalation and how various people handle it. Sometimes it's people have managed to stay calm for the whole thing, but as they're leaving, or as the other person is leaving, that's when they kind of get a jab in, or that's when they're sarcastic or something like that. That's a very understandable response, but if your goal is de-escalation, that's not ideal, because it runs the risk of things getting more escalated again. It kind of undoes the good work you've done. Try not to let your ego and pride take over. And sometimes that means letting the other person get the last word, because if they can escape the situation with a degree of dignity, that means that your de-escalation has been as successful as possible, all things considered. If you cannot return to a place of calm, it might be time to walk away or let someone else step in. And that's why paying attention to that is so important. I do want to highlight that it's okay to be not okay. I know this particular phrase is been a bit overused, but I really believe it, especially when we're talking about these kinds of conversations, because sometimes there's a lot of pressure to just be fine. No, it's not fine. It's not okay. It's upsetting. And it can be, especially if a person is making it personal or taking out their anger on you. But even other moments where they're perhaps not upset at you, but a person is in deep pain, and you're really, really tapping into your empathy. It can be painful for you as well. Sometimes it is okay to feel upset because of a challenging conversation or other difficult moments. Again, I believe that all feelings are valid, but not all behaviors or expressions of feelings are okay. So a person has a right to feel angry, but they don't have a right to scream vile threats at you. Honor your own needs as much as you can, recognizing where there might be things that are outside the scope of what you can do because of the systems you work in, or because of lack of support, or because of other things that you might be going through, but try to honor your own needs. And that example that was given earlier about what if the person isn't listening to your boundary, and you made it really clear. Yeah, then honoring your own needs is walking away, maybe telling them you're walking away, paying attention to what you need in the moment as well as after. Finally, I stole this slogan from the Problem Gambling Council, so you probably see it at the bottom of casino commercials. Know your limit, play within it. I do not believe in this ethos of push past what you can do. I would be terrible in any type of extreme sports situation. I think this is really unhealthy. I think it's better to recognize when we're getting to the part where, you know what, I can't do another conversation like this today, or I'm really depleted, or I'm really hungry, or I need somebody to talk to, or I need to breathe, or I need to walk. Knowing your limit and playing within it actually makes you better at your job and makes it more sustainable to be able to show up rather than pushing back and having to recover, pushing past and having to recover. And this is also tricky because sometimes you will be asked by others, by other individuals, by other systems to push past what you can do. So I recognize that maybe this is more of an ideal than an everyday, but I do want to just offer that there is value in playing within your limit, even if your limit isn't the same as the person working beside you, for example. We will, yeah.
Interject. There was a comment about, you talked earlier about how a lot of us will feel like we're disappointing people when we set limits or set a boundary or walk away. And what suggestions do you have for people for moving better in a direction where they don't feel like they're disappointing people by having those boundaries? I suspect reading the book Setting Boundaries and Finding Peace is a good hint, but are there some nuggets there that you can share?
Sure. And this is from my experience, personal and professional. Sometimes you're going to feel disappointed. Sometimes you're going to feel guilt. You don't have to act on that. I don't think it's about changing the feeling of oh, I don't want to disappoint someone. I think it's about having that feeling and just letting it be there. So for me, for example, sometimes your instinct to come is of like, oh, I want to say, never mind, I'll just do it. I'll just smooth it over. For me, now there are moments where I may still choose to do that, but for me, it's worth that worry about disappointing, because the payoff of having set a boundary and stuck to it in terms of my own capacity and my own well-being is bigger than that worry of disappointing somebody else. And that's just practice. And that's sometimes the guilt and the disappointment or the fear of disappointing feels too big. And we feel like we have to act. Okay. But we can choose not to act on that feeling. I think that's what we can. It's not about changing the feeling. It's about recognizing, oh, I don't want to disappoint this person, and doing it anyway and seeing what happens. Okay, we may do a breathing exercise if we have time at the end, but I know that you're a great active group and I want to have a chance to discuss the scenario. So if we come back we might do a little breathing exercise at the end if we have time. So here are 10 tips for de-escalation. Some of these we've already talked about, and these are ones that you may already be doing. Number one is take your time and be patient. I heard another trainer say years ago when I was first starting out doing education, he said, it's a false economy if you rush now. And that really stuck with me. Sometimes there's a lot of pressure to hurry up, and the pressure isn't coming from you. It's coming from above, or, the family, or you got to come on, next person. If it's possible, while recognizing there are limits to that, try to take your time and be patient. And in fact, I have found it helpful if there's a limit on time and patience, if the person just tells me that. I only have 10 minutes to talk to you about this today, and then really be present for that 10 minutes. I'd rather a present 10 minutes than a person there for half an hour who's not really paying attention or is like talking to 5 other people at the same time. I know it's not always avoidable, but if you're talking to somebody who's escalated as well, try to take your time and be patient. Attend to body language and tone of voice, both theirs and yours. What are you conveying with your tone of voice? You might be saying something where the content is calm, but if you're saying it in like a high, frantic voice, that's what is going to be communicated. Validate. Again, this doesn't mean you have to accept or agree with how the person is expressing their feelings. Validation is, I can see that you're upset. It makes sense to me that you'd be upset. And it's not necessarily saying that, but that's the message of validation. Of course, you're upset. This is a lot. And also, you know, sometimes it's setting limits side by side with that. I can see that you're upset and you have a right to be upset, but you can't throw that at me if you want to continue this conversation. Number 4 is be non-judgmental. Now, this is easier said than done, which I should trademark that because I say it all the time. It's a cliche. I can't trademark it. So be non-judgmental. So I think it is unrealistic to not judge because we're humans and we're judging people all the time. They remind us of somebody else we had an argument with yesterday. You've already talked to this person 15 times. You know, they remind you of your brother and you're having a fight with your brother. There's any number of reasons why you might actually be judging the person. Wrestling with yourself about that is going to take you away from what's happening. Instead, put your judgment to the side. Just put it on the shelf. You can look at it later or you can not. That's up to you. But for now, focus on being non-judgmental in this moment because I believe people can feel it. You know, and sometimes it's in what we say, but it's very often our facial expressions, our tone of voice, our approach with the person. They can tell if we are judging them. Number 5 is don't engage in a power struggle. Yes, this is true. No, it isn't. No, I told you, I'm the one with the file. I'm the one. I'm the nurse. I'm the doctor. I'm the one. I'm sure that many of you have been engaged in power struggles where you weren't necessarily the person with the power. And it's a lot less fun when you're that person, but it's not really fun in either situation. So when you are talking to somebody who's very upset, it might be an instinct to kind of lean on that and kind of put your foot down in that way. You can put your foot down in terms of setting limits and be firm. That's important, but you don't want to engage in a power struggle. You don't want to argue about what is true. You don't want to really say, you know, you don't even know what you're talking about. I'm the one with the degree. Anything like that. I'm not suggesting you would, but sometimes people really are adept at pulling out behavior that we wouldn't necessarily exhibit. Number 6 is connect with the emotion that's under the behavior. So that's what we talked about before, you know, recognizing if person is talking at me very angrily, that's only part of what's going on. You know, what else is happening there? And sometimes we can't understand the content of what people are saying if they're highly distressed or, you know, if they're dealing with a cognitive condition or certain mental illnesses, it might be difficult to follow the content of what they're saying. But you can always try to connect with the emotion that's under that's coming out across from their words. Number 7 is agree to disagree. And yeah, sometimes people will really try to bait you. No, we're going to argue about this. No, okay, that's your opinion. And you're entitled to it. Let's move on and talk about this. Number 8, give people the opportunity to save face. And this is especially important if there's an audience, you know, their family or other staff, or, you know, there's people can feel more pressure to show off or to like, you know, it's important to resist the urge. If your goal is de-escalation, resist the urge to do or say something that in an attempt to try to make the person feel ashamed or small or more vulnerable. Number 9 is let people vent where you can, paying attention to just how powerful that can be when you can see things calming down a little bit. And number 10, as I said, is know your limits, which is an ongoing, our limits aren't static. On a given day, I might have more capacity for other people's anger than on another day, depending on what else is going on. Okay, so what we're going to do first is I'm going to go to these group scenarios to warm you up, and then I'll invite anybody who wants to put one in the chat, and then I will ask Val to read it out. We can choose one or a couple, and then we will kind of ask you what you might do in that situation. So, but first, let's use a one here for everybody. Here's the scenario. A patient has just been given a very difficult diagnosis. When you enter the room, they start screaming at you because their dinner is late. This is not your fault or your role, but trying to explain that is only seeming to anger the person further. So how might you proceed here? Feel free to pop some responses in the chat.
Okay, so acknowledging and naming their emotion, an empathetic response, acknowledging that they're angry and validate that emotion, kind of doing some of the tasky stuff, checking on the status of dinner, trying to get them their dinner, contacting dietary, finding out what might have happened. You know, once they've kind of expressed their anger, ask them what's real, how they're really feeling, what else is going on, what else happened during the day. Yeah, so lots of folks checking on the status of dinner, which would allow a few moments for calm.
Yes, that's beautiful. And it allows a few moments for calm, but it also and it lets the person pause and you pause as well, but it also lets them know that you've heard their concern. Yeah. You've heard that they're upset about the dinner. And you're right, it might only be one of the things that they're upset about, but this is something that you could take some steps to work towards, even if it's not your role. So, oh, I can see that. Sorry, I got too eager, so I pulled up the chat too. And I can see there's so much in terms of, let me check on that. Can I get you a snack while you wait? Oh, beautiful.
Suzanne's, you're right. Dinner's late. I'm sorry. That idea of saying I'm sorry. I know it was a difficult day.
Yeah, I love that. And that validation really goes such a long way, because the person is probably expecting you to, you know, just say, oh, that's not my job or whatever. And I'm not, you know, that's whenever you can choose. I've said that a few times, but I've noticed that myself when I'm upset and when I'm the calm one in other situations, that it really treating the person with kindness and with some clearly demonstrating that you've heard their concern and that you're going to do what you can to take some steps. It matters. It really matters. So, oh, it's so beautiful responses. So validation, the power of I'm sorry, like looking into it. This is so great. Thanks, everyone. I won't take over your job, Val. I just got too.
That's okay.
So the other piece too, somebody mentioned that there might be something else going on there, and I just want to highlight something that I've noticed lately, both in myself and in other people. Sometimes we can handle the big things, and it's the little things that undo us. And so, you know, they may want to talk about what else is going on, but I noticed that somebody mentioned earlier, that was such a great point, that it can be hard to empathize when the thing that the person is upset about, it feels disproportionate, their degree of upset to what the thing is. And I've just noticed that it very often is a tip of the iceberg, or the other cliche, the straw that broke the camel's back kind of a situation. That one final small thing, they may have dealt with all kinds of difficult, bigger things this week or this life. And it's just sometimes the one more moment where we don't have any control, the one more thing that is, I used to say in the pandemic, I'd lost my tolerance for my capacity to navigate small disappointments. When you're dealing with the big things collectively or individually, sometimes we use up all our energy on that. So they might not even know that, but I've just noticed that a lot lately. So that can be helpful in terms of tapping into patience and recognizing, I mean, dinner is important. If the person hasn't eaten, like that's a core need, but sometimes there might be other moments where they're upset about something else that seems small, and it's just a little piece of the puzzle. You can't see the whole thing that's going on there. Okay, thanks everyone. Let's go to the next one. Your patient's daughter is upset, angry. She says to you, you would never treat your own parent like this. Do you pick and choose who to ignore in the morning? So how might you approach this situation? If, let's say she's saying it a lot more angrily than I did right there. When I was a kid, I thought that I would be good at acting because I like public speaking. Oh, different skill set, people. Different skill set. Terrible at acting. Mhm. Okay, Val, I'll turn it over to you. I'm reading, but I'll let you talk.
Okay, so I guess trying to get a sense of a bit more what's going on there, like what made the daughter say that statement.
It is a bit vague, so yeah, I think that's good.
Again, the apology idea. The only thing is with it being so vague, it's a bit difficult to know what you're apologizing for, right? It's kind of a bit different than the meal being late, right? So lots of people seeking clarity around what's upset her, what's happening.
Right.
Acknowledging that she feels upset.
Good. So the other thing too is you might choose to use open-ended kind of invitations like tell me why you're upset or tell me what happened rather than peppering the person with why questions. Sometimes when we ask a lot of why questions, it kind of makes the person feel a bit cornered, and it's also harder for us because we're leading them in a particular direction. So just if you have the time to just really listen to what she is upset about, you might be able to get some more information here.
Is there a place for it? I saw it somewhere, for explaining like we're short staffed today, or I'm sorry we didn't get to your mom sooner, like we are.
Yes, if you keep that kind of tight. Like what I mean is you don't necessarily, not that I'm suggesting anybody would, but sometimes it can feel like excuses or like a long explanation. If you keep it kind of concise like that example you gave, that I think that's great. Combining an apology with I'm sorry we're short staffed this morning, what can I do to help, or what can we do differently? So you're acknowledging that without getting too lost in it. I think that's important. Any other questions or things you want to add there? I moved it out of the way so that I wouldn't look at it anymore.
Ken just commented, the daughter may feel a loss of control. So, try to give her back some control in that situation.
That's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. And control on so many levels, right? Like, she's taking care of her parent now. Maybe that's wasn't what she expected, or that's maybe there's all kinds of complicated feelings there, grief and loss. So as well as, not really understanding maybe what's happening.
And while, you might feel like you want to run away from the situation, be very, attentive to your body language and giving undivided attention.
Yeah, I think that can be quite powerful actually, because we don't know if it's mistreatment or neglect or ignoring. We don't know exactly what the nature of the mistreatment is, or how the daughter's feeling, but really being open to hearing that, I think, and having the time to listen if you're able to. And again, I do want to respect how pressured everybody's time is, but I think 3 minutes of attentive, empathetic listening is more important than 15 minutes of not paying attention in terms of helping the person to de-escalate, helping that connection to form, and helping the person to feel heard. Great. Anything else you want to add? Or anything else I missed?
I think we can go on.
Thanks, everyone. This is fun to do it this way. Okay, scenario 3. 2 residents in long-term care are arguing loudly with each other. The discussion is escalating and getting more aggressive. There are 2 healthcare workers available to help. How might the 2 of you proceed?
So context would depend on cognitive capacity. Possibly each person take one resident and attempt to distract them, or remove them from proximity with the other. Take one person for a walk and talk to her.
Good.
Redirect focus to something else if possible. Ask what's going on. That's a good one. Pointing out, you know, how can we help you? It seems you're having an argument. Anything we can do to help. Trying to mediate if mediation is kind of appropriate, depending on, you know, the cognitive status of people. And then,
yes, although, sorry, I will interrupt about the mediation. So yes, although maybe now is not the moment for that. If they are arguing, that's partly why I included two people, because of that idea of separating them and not physically, ideally, like going for a walk with one person, having the other worker listen to what's going on, helps them to calm down and helps each person to feel heard. And there might be room for mediation later, but you want to avoid mediating an argument right in the middle like this, because sometimes it just gets more heated.
Yeah, Denis has a nice response. He says, there is clearly an issue here that needs to be resolving, but first, can each of you talk with one of us, and we'll plan to speak together later today.
Perfect. I love that. So that's a couple of skills you're highlighting there. One is forecasting, which is letting people know what's going to happen, which is a wonderful skill when we're feeling out of control for various reasons. It's great to hear what the next steps are. And you're giving the person options there, and you're using really plain, clear language and saying what you see. All of that really important. I love how some of the stuff that's coming up is, you know, you seem to be having an argument. You're really focusing on what's obvious. You're not like, you know, you're picking a fight with him again. Like they would say that, but sometimes I've noticed people do all kinds of things in these escalated moments, and really keeping the language neutral. That's also helpful if there is cognitive difficulty as well. You want to keep it as clear and plain as possible when you are talking to anybody who's upset, frankly, because when we're upset, our cognitive capacity is impacted. Even if there aren't other barriers the rest of the time, when we're upset, we can't reason in the same way that we might in other moments. So.
And a lot of consensus on if there's cognitive impairment or dementia, to look at the distraction kinds of techniques.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Sorry, I meant to mention that again. Distraction. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Like, and you can, I mean, it can all be part of it, right? Why don't you come over here? Can you show me what kind of tea you like again? I can't remember. Or like, oh, we're talking earlier about this game. Can you explain that to me again? Like, you know, any kind of distraction is important, but then also that can be a moment of connection as well, and reconnection. So creating a little bit of space between the upset and this moment. So great job. Okay, what we're going to do now, to give you the chance to share some scenarios, is if you have one that you would like to share, and what we'll do is, if you would like to share it, we won't get to all of them, but pop it in the chat, and then we will read it, and then we'll toss it out to the group and see, and I'll highlight anything, what skills people are saying, or I'll add my 2 cents if it's worthwhile. But this is a chance for you to apply your own expertise, perhaps the skills we've talked about today, or your own skills, and a chance for your colleagues to kind of hear it. So if anybody wants to put a scenario in there, we will work with that.
Carl, I have a memory, Carl, of us being able to unmute folks who might raise their hand and be okay with being unmuted and part of the recording as well. So that's an option for people. If you want us, if you're getting tired of putting stuff in the chat and want to use your voice, raise your hand, and then Carl, the all-powerful, will unmute you.
And just to note, if we do that, I know Val just mentioned it, but we are recording the session, so
make sure there's nothing confidential. And
if you are unmuting and turning your video on, it will be in the YouTube video recording. So yeah. And you can just let us know if you want to, just write in the chat if you do want to unmute, or
Yeah, I see distraction as a very helpful tool. Sometimes it's a helpful tool for us too, to kind of break up the energy of an upset conversation. Sometimes it's after the fact that we need to be distracted, but yeah.
Khadijah's got a good one there, I think. So a family member who's a physician disagrees with the treatment plan, insisting on personal updates daily or twice daily, which in the context of the critical care isn't always possible, asking for treatments which aren't necessarily in the best interests of the patient.
Ah, this is an excellent example. Any feedback or any suggestions? I'm sure that some of you may have dealt with something similar. April, we'll come back to yours in a moment. Okay, well, I see some other things coming up and we will try to get to those. Redirect him to the attending physician is a suggestion.
In
That is
Khadijah's
good.
case, I think they're probably the physician.
Oh, okay. Okay. Because that is that if you're not a physician, yeah, you're right. That's a good knock up the chain situation.
Yeah.
But okay. Any other suggestions around that one?
Amanda suggested the family conference involving other members of the interprofessional team.
Good. Some of it might involve as well. We didn't speak about this directly, but I'm sure you've heard of the broken record technique, which involves saying the same thing more than once. And so it's important to use a calm, even tone and to try to not do that in a way that's sarcastic or condescending, but sometimes repeating the same information and doing what you can to stay calm. The other thing that might be helpful in this situation is and you'll have to feel this out and feel if this is reasonable for you, but sometimes I think acknowledging a person's experience and expertise, and it's sort of a boundary and a validation at the same time. I could say, I appreciate your feedback around this. I know that you have a lot of experience with this. This is the treatment plan that we're moving forward with right now. This is why. And sometimes these kinds of patients might need, or family members might take a little bit more time, because you might need to kind of say, this is why I'm doing this, and explaining why you're choosing what you're choosing. So I know that might not be possible depending on time pressures and so on, but giving the person something to take away as well. And if there's a way to genuinely kind of acknowledge their input, again, people need to feel heard no matter what degree of expertise they have or don't have. So but it is a tricky one though. Other responses to that one?
A couple of, somebody talked about, and I think recognizing the challenge. Beth's got a good one here. Emphasize that it's difficult to be in the role of a son and this situation. It's hard when your family member's sick. Would it help if we could discuss what your family member would want if they could tell us right now?
Ah, lovely. Yeah, really good. Okay, we'll leave that one for now. Thank you, everybody, for your feedback around that. Let's go to...
So there's the, what do I do if somebody's going to throw something at me?
Okay, so, I mean, my first... the first thing that pops into my head is duck. Now, it depends what the thing is, but if a person is going to throw something at you, you need to take care of yourself. So whether that's moving out of the way, whether that's leaving, as long as there aren't other people who can be hurt, sometimes people are going to do what they're going to do. So if it seems that the person is going to throw something at you, you get out of there. You can say what you're doing if you want to, but sometimes there isn't time for that. So get out of the way and take care of yourself.
Yeah. That's
Oh,
your,
sorry.
you can only, you can't de-escalate somebody else,
No,
right?
that's
So
right.
it's about safety.
I know everybody's saying duck and dodge just like I did. Yeah.
Um,
And yeah.
Somebody talked about, are these things we can use with our own family members as well?
Mhm. Thank you for that question. So, you know what? This is funny. I should do a separate training just on de-escalating with family, because this came up at another completely different group I was working with this week. I think some of the skills are similar. I think boundaries are still really important. I think empathizing where possible is important. I do think there are particular challenges to staying calm, for example, in a family situation. And sometimes, we're able to stay calm till the cows come home in professional situations and not so much in personal ones. So I think that some of the skills and approaches apply. But I think there are other complexities involved in a family relationship, in family relationships as well, where this might be a starting place, or it might be part of what's needed. But um, it it really depends on the situation. I do think boundaries are really especially important in terms of negotiations and conflict in families, but that's only one part of it. So short answer, some of it's useful, but it depends on the family.
There's a couple of scenarios. Jennifer and Susanna both shared situations where the response that they're getting from another person is really, really personal. So Jennifer talks about, being challenged, what you're not helping at all. What's your education? Do you have any degrees? And then Suzanne's case saying, I paid my taxes. It'll be your fault when my mom or dad falls and dies. Or, if you can't provide care, the patient's going to consider medical assistance and dying. So some really hurtful, hard things to hear.
Yeah. And so a couple of things. Thank you so much for sharing. Those are very difficult things to hear. And let alone, when you've had a long shift, or, when you're trying your best to help the person, it can feel, I've had this experience where I feel quite self-righteous and huffy. I'm trying to help you. Why are you like this? I'm trying to help you. So I think there's a few of the things we talked about today to keep in mind in this moment. Self-awareness. So knowing in advance, and we don't always know this, but reflecting on what are the kinds of things that are your bruise points? What are the kinds of things that are particularly sensitive for you in this juncture? What are the things that, if just being aware of because people will say really nasty things sometimes. And so being aware of what's particular soft spots for you, just knowing that in advance can help a little bit in those moments. Also paying attention to what's happening in your body in the moment. If you feel yourself getting really escalated or really upset, what can you do to mitigate that or to leave? Sometimes if a person is being really, really hurtful or hateful, you can say, I like to be able to help, but it looks like we're not getting anywhere right now. I'm going to come back a little bit later. Sometimes something that lets you take yourself out of the situation so that you can get a little bit more calm, so that you can get the support you need. If you're not able to continue, maybe there's somebody else. That's another trick that can help sometimes. It doesn't seem like I'm going to be able to help you. We're not getting anywhere. I'm going to see if there's somebody else who might be able to do a better job of helping you. Now, you don't want to do that if if you know that the only person available for 11 miles or kilometers is you. Like you don't want to set it up for, but you're not going to make false promises. You're going to say, I'm going to see if there's somebody else who might be able to help you a little bit better. That gives you an out, lets you stay calm, and also protects you a little bit from the vitriol, because that's a lot of stuff that they're spewing on you. The other thing that might be helpful, again, maybe not in the moment if you're not able to access it, but at least after, is recognizing that all of that stuff that you mentioned that people are saying is out of fear. They are trying to throw some stuff at you because they don't know what else to do. And they feel really afraid and really powerless and really out of control. And part of them wants to make you feel like that. It doesn't mean it's fair. It doesn't mean it's a healthy and desired approach. But when you're seeing people in healthcare settings, as you well know, they are often not at their best. So on any level, so you're not seeing people when they're at their best, and they might be showing you the worst of themselves, actually, which is not fair and not okay. But it also suggests that that's not always what you're going to see from them. Sometimes if you take a break and come back later, sometimes people have had a chance to calm down. Sometimes you can offer some other information, or they've had some time to reflect, and sometimes they might redirect it a little bit. So, but I think self-awareness, taking care of yourself, being clear about boundaries, and trying to realize that it's not about you, that there's a lot of fear there that's fueling that kind of angry talk. And we all have things that really get under our skin. Many years ago, I was working with homeless folks in Ireland, and there was a lady that, it was a volunteer job, and there was a woman that said to me, "You're just trying to climb up the corporate ladder." And there was no corporate ladder, and for some reason that really stuck with me, and I was so huffy, and I had been able to stay calm the rest of the time, but then I was really in a snit about it, and I couldn't put that one down. So anyway.
There's another situation, it's on the phone, and we actually, a lot of us do have interactions on the phone. So I had a situation where a family member called, the patient was in a lot of distress. I was asking questions to try to assess what was going on, and the family got really upset with me for asking questions, hung up on me. I ended up calling them back, and we came up with a plan, but I wondered if I could have prevented the initial hang up, or whether it's ideal to call someone back right away when this scenario happens.
It depends on the situation. I mean, when you're de-escalating on the phone, it's both easier and more difficult. It's easier because you don't have to worry about physical proximity or something throwing something at you, but it's more difficult because you don't have all of the cues that you might have when you're seeing the person in person. So you know, it's not necessarily anything I think that was a reasonable approach, trying to get more information about what had happened. The family brought their upset to the call. They were already upset. You didn't cause them to be upset, and so they may have hung up even if you said nothing. Excuse me. So the thing about hanging up is that it does give people the chance to pause and reset. And so even though it's a little rude for them to hang up on you, sometimes when you're able to go back later, and I think it depends on the situation. If it's urgent, you do call back relatively soon after. If you think it can wait and they need more time to calm down before you can come up with a plan, maybe you wait a little bit. But I think that you didn't do, you know, we in a moment, sometimes all we have is the hanging up. I remember once I love pharmacists, but once there was one pharmacist that was very rude to me, and I said, "Well, you don't have to be so rude." And then I hung up the phone, and it was very satisfying, I have to say, because so maybe that's just what they needed to do in that moment. But certainly, I'm not suggesting you were rude. You did everything right, sounds to me. But you can't prevent a hang up. It's one of those things where you can't change another person's behavior. Like, it's okay. Sometimes it's not a bad thing. It buys everybody a little time to reflect and calm down. Are there other, what do you think, Val? Should we take one more scenario and then go to questions?
Yeah, there's one more. It was relating to family conflict. So kind of like the two residents, but this is two family members. Now it sounded like they might not have been face to face, but it was, you know, escalating kind of situation with family members having very kind of different demands of the healthcare providers.
Oh, like that's all you need. So some of the same principles apply. I think if it's possible to have someone listen to both sides, ideally separate from, so that you're not mediating them at the same time. If you can't do it, then you can, you know, make a meaningful promise for, not a promise, but like a plan, like, you know, I'm going to be in, you know, this day, and I'll come and talk to you then. If you're going to be here, we can talk about it then. Like giving them some options, so you let them know that you will hear their perspectives, but now's not the time necessarily to have the conversation. So it does depend a little bit on the degree and the content and so on. But again, remembering that people are at their worst now in a situation like this, and certainly situations like dying and grief and all the complexity of health bring out some complicated family dynamics. So you may be the unfortunate recipient of some of that, but I think clear boundaries as well. You know, if let's say they're upsetting the patient or they're not able to calm down, like, you know, you can ask them to leave the room. You can do what's in the best interest of the people you're trying to care for. So.
Great.
All right, folks, any questions? I'm going to go back to the breathing. Oh, no, I don't have to go back to the slide. I know what it is. We're going to do a breathing exercise in a minute or two, but I want to make sure there's time for questions or any suggestions or feedback. I do want to emphasize this point that you can't fix people or their problems. And I believe people can change, but you cannot change them. They will not change unless and until they want to. Not because you guilt them, not because you have provide them with information. Those things can be helpful for them in the long run, not the guilting, but the information. But they're going to make their own decisions whether or not you agree with them. This was really fun for me. You're a wonderful group. Thanks so much. We're not quite done yet, but I'm thanking you now. Okay, so while we're waiting for questions, if anything else comes up, I want to do just do this brief little breathing exercise with you. I like ones that are very small and manageable because sometimes that's all that's possible. So this one is called Find Your Feet or Find Your Seat. And it's exactly what it says. If it's accessible to you to put your feet on the ground right now and pay attention, just literally grounding yourself and paying attention to how your feet feel on the floor. Maybe wiggling your toes a little bit if it's possible. Lifting your heels up if you can. We're just so often in our talking and in our thoughts and feelings. It's nice to get back into your bod for a second. And the alternative or the companion to that is find your seat. So pay attention to how your butt feels in the chair if you can, or how your back feels against the back of the chair. If you have arms on the chair where you are, might just touch those arms for a moment, or the fabric on the seat. Just using your senses to tap into the chair or the couch or wherever you are right now. And the other quick exercise I'll share with you is from the meditation teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh. And he reminded us that it is as simple sometimes as saying breathing in as you're breathing in and breathing out as you're breathing out. And I like that because you can make it as digestible and portable as you like. So if you're able to today, we'll do three breaths at your own pace, saying quietly to yourself, breathing in as you breathe in and breathing out as you breathe out. We'll do 3 starting now. Okay, beautiful. So
one of the participants shared that they were told by an older, mature nurse practitioner once that We cannot fix within a few months of care the family dysfunction that took years to develop.
I love that. That's such a beautiful point. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. That's really true. Recognizing there's what your part of the web is. That's great.
Caitlin asked if you had any tips on what a situation where someone confronts you about something and the accusation or the situation they bring up isn't true at all.
I mean, that's tricky. It depends on what it is, right? So that's tricky. I think I don't think I can give a general answer to that, because it depends if it is something that could be harmful to you or your job, for example. Then it's a little bit different than an agree to disagree situation. I would say, you know, if it feels manageable, you can say, this is how I see it. This is my perspective, but it depends a little bit. If they're really stuck on the fact that their perspective is the only perspective, you might need to step away and consult with somebody, a wise colleague, a supervisor you trust, about how to proceed, because it does depend a little bit on the situation. Does anybody else have any either questions or things you'd like to add, de-escalation tips or bits of wisdom you've learned along your career that you can share with the rest of us? Now's the time. I love that one. We cannot fix within a few months of care the family dysfunction that took years to develop. That's really true. So beautiful. I see a tip there. Make sure to take time to debrief with a trusted colleague, manager, etc. after the de-escalation. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the nice feedback, friends. This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it. And I really appreciate all your engagement. It makes it so much more fun.